Okay, my name is Norman Neymark, and it's my privilege and honor to introduce our speaker today, Dr. Rhiannon Neilsen, who is currently the Cybersecurity Postdoctoral Fellow at CSAC, and is also has a job this coming year as Assistant Professor in International Security at Baruch College, City University of New York. So we're all happy about that. Jobs are good. She's also published a tremendous amount. I'm not going to list her publications. That's also good. Her research focuses on digital technologies in conflict, specifically cyber, social media, and AI, mass information, disinformation, and the ethics of war. Again, she has a number of articles, and we've just been talking about op-eds on these subjects. So let's welcome Rhiannon, and we look forward to the seminar. Thank you.
Thanks, everyone. Thanks, Norman, for the kind introduction. And thanks to all of you for choosing to spend your Tuesday afternoon with me. As I'm sure most of you are aware, it's been about 2 weeks since the 30th anniversary of the Rwandan genocide. So I'm really honored and privileged to have the opportunity to talk to all of you about genocide prevention today, ideally into the 21st century. Most of what I'll be spending the next 30 minutes on is most of my book manuscript, Algorithms and Atrocities, Cyber Humanitarian Interventions for 21st Century Conflicts. And I wanted to start with some examples of kinds of cyber operations to help just contextualize my research. So in 1999, this man here, Slobodan Milosevic, waged a widespread campaign of ethnic cleansing, sexual assault, and murder of ethnic Albanians in Kosovo. And during this time, the US was actually able to hack into Milosevic's bank accounts and his email correspondences, but they refrained from causing any damage to these systems that were being used to facilitate these crimes. And that's because the US didn't want to, quote, show their hand regarding their cyber capabilities at the turn of the 21st century. Upon finding out what the US had failed to do, the then NATO Supreme Commander in Europe, General Wesley Clark, said, quote, more could have been done to perhaps force the Yugoslav president Milosevic into submission without the bombing campaign. Now, I realize it's a really big call, but it at least points to the option of using cyber to disrupt perpetrators as late as the 20th century. A few years later, immediately prior to the US invasion of Iraq in 2003, again, the US hacked into the Iraqi secure military defense network, and they sent emails to key Iraqi leaders and personnel, essentially encouraging them to defect. And amazingly, a lot of them did. They put on their civilian clothes, they parked their tanks neatly outside their bases, and they went home without a fight. A few days ago, Herb also told me that the US contemplated sending emails that seemed to appear as though it was coming from Saddam Hussein himself, urging his troops to lay down their weapons. But for reasons I can get into in the Q&A, if that's of interest, they chose not to. More recently, the Australian Signals Directorate, US Cyber Command, and GCHQ in the UK waged Operation Glowing Symphony against ISIS. And by hacking into ISIS's networks, the Allies deleted terabytes and terabytes of propaganda material that was being used for recruitment purposes. They changed passwords so that the militants couldn't get back into their networks. They blocked communications among their members, and they frustrated their ability to pay their militants and buy things like food, ammunition, and oil. According to an inside source, pretty understandably, ISIS found this extremely frustrating, saying, quote, they didn't know what the hell was going on with their networks. And so what I hope this provides us is a bit of an insight into what's possible via cyberspace in conflict settings, at least as far back as the late 1990s. But as you can probably tell, a lot of this tends to focus on counterterrorism operations, specifically terrorist organizations that threaten the West, not atrocity prevention more broadly. And so this is where my research comes in. And today I'll be traversing three main questions. How can offensive cyberspace operations and online influence campaigns prevent atrocities? Again, specifically genocides, war crimes, crimes against humanity, and ethnic cleansings. What are the ethical objections to deploying such cyber operations to protect populations from atrocities? And who or what exactly in the international system has duties to deploy cyber and online influence operations to protect vulnerable populations? To answer these questions, I'm going to start with the empirical foundation of what gave rise to this concept that I'm calling cyber humanitarian interventions, and I'll unpack precisely what I mean by that. I'll then navigate through some of the main ethical objections and considerations that I have to deploying these capabilities. and then identify the main moral agents in the international system that has duties to realize them. And then I think the best part, opening it up for Q&A, because I'm really excited to hear your feedback. I apologize in advance for how much text is about to appear on these slides. I really try to minimize how much text I have in PowerPoint presentations, but I just felt it was important to illustrate the breadth and depth of the interviews that I did to generate this concept. So I conducted 44 elite semi-structured interviews, both with cyber experts, so folks who've had their hands on the keyboards. This includes individuals at the Army Cyber Institute, US at West Point, the US Cyber Command, NATO HQ in Brussels, and the NATO CCDCOE, which is the longest acronym in the world, but it's essentially just the Cyber Excellence Center in Estonia, as well as humanitarian experts. So these are individuals who have had their feet on the ground in sites that are experiencing atrocities or are at risk of experiencing atrocities, as well as practitioners and policymakers in DC. So individuals from the International Committee for the Red Cross, the State Department, the US Holocaust Memorial Museum, and as you can see, a sort of whole host of offices and departments within the United Nations. And what my interviewees consistently highlighted, especially the humanitarian experts, is that these are not your grandparents' perpetrators. Genocides, war crimes, crimes against humanity, and ethnic cleansing, of course, is not unique to the 21st century. But what is unique about this century is the role of digital technologies in executing their crimes. So simply put, the perpetrators are online. According to one of my interviewees, who was an NGO worker in Afghanistan during the 2021 withdrawal, he said, quote, "The Taliban are going door to door, looking for people who worked in NGOs, government, military, or said anything against them in public, and are using people's social media profiles to map out who's who. In effect, this is an execution list." Solomon in the UN Department of Peace Operations said, "In Mali and Yemen, yes, it's obvious. You're always impressed by the fact that people in the middle of the Sahara Desert have access to the internet." And this includes the Houthi rebels actually mining cryptocurrency to fund their exploits. Shah from the UN Office of Counterterrorism said, "If you go to Maduguri, a place previously occupied by Boko Haram in Nigeria, you find that people don't have enough money to eat a proper meal, but people will be holding some outdated model of a smartphone through which the internet could be used." And an anonymous worker at the ICRC said, "I do not think ISWAP, that's the Islamic State in the Western African province, or Boko Haram, would be able to operate without any internet connectivity, to be perfectly honest. They need it to communicate both internally and for coordination, and to have propaganda and to receive funds." And so we know that perpetrators today are increasingly leveraging these new technologies to fund their crimes, coordinate amongst themselves, propagandize, and celebrate their crimes almost as trophies after the fact online. And so this brings me to what my focus is today, and that's what I'm calling cyber humanitarian interventions. I define a cyber humanitarian intervention as the sophisticated use of cyber operations and online influence campaigns that try to disrupt perpetrators' means and motivations for their crimes. Again, specifically genocides, war crimes, crimes against humanity, ethnic cleansings. By disrupting perpetrators' means for atrocities, I'm referring to cyber operations that hack into the perpetrators' networks and block their communication lines, frustrate their transport systems, manipulate logistical supply chains, reroute weapons, oil, ammunition shipments, stymie funding, and so on. So essentially everything logistical and resource-wise that the perpetrators actually need to go through with their crimes. By disrupting perpetrators' motivations for atrocities, I'm referring to online measures that try to convince the potential perpetrators not to condone or participate in the violence itself. Now, most of the literature looking at online content leading to offline harms tends to prioritize things like deleting online hate speech, deprioritizing toxic content so that it doesn't appear as high up in your newsfeed, debunking or disputing conspiracy theories, and of course, deleting repeat offenders. I think that's all very important. I do think it is a little bit of a whack-a-mole approach to the issue, but I'm just going to put that to one side for the moment and concentrate on what I see as more proactive measures to undermine perpetrators' motivations. The first way that I see this is what I call targeted educational campaigns. And these are tailor-made facts-based advertisements that appear on individuals' social media feeds that advocate for things like respect for human rights, toleration, and restraint. Crucially, these targeted educational campaigns need to be based on individuals' big data, their likes, their searches, their posts, their location, and so on. So I'm sure in the same way that all of us in this room get very different tailor-made targeted ads, the idea here is to have the content resonate most precisely with those individuals. So I like to think about this as kind of like leaflet dropping in war, but with the scale, speed, and I think most importantly, the specificity of the messaging. The next way in which I think we can envisage undermining perpetrators' motivations is via what I call atrocity suppressing disinformation campaigns. And as the name kind of suggests, this is very similar to the targeted educational campaigns, but it's based on falsities and fake news. So the idea here is to try and get the potential perpetrators to simply stay at home. We're rendering them epistemically worse off so they don't actually go and participate in the violence. An example of this might be something like, the road leading to the Rohingya ethnic minority in Myanmar has been flooded. You can't get there today. Or the victim population is actually that way instead of this way. Or let's wait until the international delegation within our country has left. We're receiving a lot of international attention. Let's just hold off for a bit. Or another example might be potential perpetrators receiving a targeted ad on their Facebook that says something like, if you go through with these war crimes, you will be prosecuted at the International Criminal Court in The Hague. And that might seem weird that I'm regarding that as a disinformation campaign, but when you actually look at the individual prosecution rates of individual perpetrators, it is abysmally low and they get away with a lot of impunity. The reason why this is blacked out today is because I gave a whole talk on this last year at CSAC. So if you don't have anything else better to do with your time, which I'm sure you do, you can watch that if you're interested, or I can talk about it in the Q&A. But really, for the purposes of today, I'm just going to be focusing on these two main issues. Before I go into the benefits of what I think these cyber humanitarian interventions can do for us, I do just want to take a moment to highlight the powerful potential of big data analytics and the kinds of insights that we can glean from what people actually search for on Google. If you've been stuck in a conversation with me for more than about 10 minutes, which you now all have, I will bring up this book. It's called Everybody Lies by Seth Steven David Owitz. And what he does in this book is he analyzes individuals' anonymous Google searches, including the time, date, location, and the precise wording, the content of the Google search. And he analyzes this to pass out and identify various different themes and trends. And in one example, he found the single biggest correlating factor between what people were searching for on Google and then support for Donald Trump in the 2016 US Republican primaries. If I've already played this game with you, please don't shout out an answer, but otherwise I do just want to take a second to throw it out and get, what do you think people were Googling? And then that correlating with support for Donald Trump in the 2016 US Republican primaries. Just throw it out to me. Come on, guys, you're smart people.
Pornography.
Yeah, not a bad shout, pornography. What else? Hillary's emails. Yeah, awesome. Thanks, Ron. Great replacement. Awesome. Thanks, Alan. Okay, so more than pornography, more than the Great Replacement, more than Hillary's emails, more than gun rights, opposition to immigration, opposition to LGBTQA+ issues, were people sitting around Googling the N-word. N-word lynch, N-word smelly, N-word joke. And they were doing this at like 12:34 p.m. on a Tuesday during their lunch break. And so what Steven David Owitz argues in his book is that people's search for information is information in and of itself. And often it's information that is brutally honest, things that people don't want to certainly not admit to pollsters or to their colleagues or even to their loved ones, and sometimes even to themselves. And there's brilliant examples in this book I can go through if that's of interest. And what I'm arguing here is that we can use this kind of approach to identify where sites of atrocity crimes might flare up and the kinds of narratives that are circulating in the community, and then curate targeted educational campaigns based on this big data analytic to target these individuals in a way that makes best sense to them. Okay, I'm pretty biased. I think there's some benefits to these cyber humanitarian interventions. They promise to be less harmful for the protectors and the protected. They're likely to be less costly in terms of blood, political reputation, environment, and treasure. They're more discriminate, proportionate, and reversible. Obviously, it's much easier to switch the lights back on after a cyber attack than it is to rebuild critical infrastructure. And this is all relative to other more forceful and traditional measures to protect that have long been considered morally permissible or indeed even required to safeguard populations from things like genocide. So this includes things like widespread economic sanctions that unfortunately end up hurting the people more than the regime. Arming rebels, obviously flooding a crisis zone full of weapons has their own ethical issues tantamount to it. And then, of course, unfortunately, bombing beneficiaries and putting boots on the ground. Michael Lumpkin, who at the time was the coordinator of the Global Engagement Center at the State Department, I think summarizes this really well, again, in the context of counterterrorism. He says, using Facebook ads, I can go grab an audience. I pick country X. I need age group 13 to 34. I need people who liked Abu Baghdadi or any other set. and I can shoot and hit them directly with messages for literally pennies a click to do so. It's a very low investment to be highly targeted toward the enemy. And so what I think these cyber humanitarian interventions do is they may actually serve to bolster the political will to do something and overcome much of the political paralysis that we're confronted with when we see something like genocide. I also think it could help mitigate the body bag aversion problem, that is this increased hesitancy within the West to send our soldiers off to distant lands to save strangers, this sort of casualty aversion that we have. And at the very least, I think we have duties to consider these cyber humanitarian interventions prior to more harmful measures to protect. Obviously, I'm not proposing these cyber humanitarian interventions as a silver bullet. I don't think that we can control, alt-delete genocide, but I do think it's just another tool in the atrocity prevention toolbox that we haven't given that much consideration to. Given all of this, are these cyber humanitarian interventions a priori ethically permissible? If we accept that we are ethically required to protect via lethal force, so armed humanitarian interventions, then surely anything that falls short of this would be fine, right? If it's okay to actually kill the perpetrators and unfortunately some bystanders, rescuers, and victims that are caught in the crossfire, then these cyber humanitarian interventions should be totally fine. Obviously, I don't think that. That would be a considerably shorter talk. I do actually have quite a few objections to this concept in the book, but just given time constraints, I'm going to go through the main three. The first is the potential for abuse. So the idea here is that these cyber humanitarian interventions opens Pandora's box, and the same cyber capabilities will be used to foster things like political division, hysteria, and upheaval. But bluntly, these cyber humanitarian interventions will be used and abused by bad faith actors for the ends of actually fomenting and enabling violence. I think what this objection ignores is the fact that Pandora's box is already open. Governments and violent non-state armed groups are already employing cyber capabilities to propagate hate speech and coordinate amongst themselves. And so these cyber humanitarian interventions are intended to respond to the ways in which perpetrators are already online. Moreover, just because something could be used for ill purposes doesn't mean that it's inherently unjust. Writing in 1625, a Dutch lawyer and diplomat, Hugo Grotius, I think summarizes this logic very well. He says, "But the use that wicked men make of a thing does not always hinder it from being just in itself. Pirates sail on the seas and thieves wear swords." So if Hugo Grotius was writing not in 1625, but in 2024, he might say something like, "Pirates sail on the seas, thieves wear swords, and war criminals also tweet." I think what this objection nevertheless highlights is that any abuse of cyber humanitarian interventions, like armed humanitarian interventions, is condemnable. It's by definition abuse of the concept. The second objection is what I call containment complexities, and that's the difficulty of ensuring that the effects of the cyber humanitarian interventions only affect the systems that are being used to realize the atrocity crimes, and so that it doesn't spill over and affect other systems like hospitals or schools. I think the first reply to this is that it is possible to design cyber operations that only cause damage to the targeted system. So a really great example of this is Stuxnet, which many of you would be aware of. It was a cyber attack, a malicious worm designed ostensibly by the US and Israel that infected millions of computer systems worldwide. But it only caused damage to its intended target, the Iranian nuclear centrifuges, causing them to speed up or slow down to such an extent that they failed. And the Iranian nuclear scientists at the time just thought that their science was dodgy. They didn't realize that they were under a cyber attack until the operation itself was escalated. I think the second objection is that even if these cyber humanitarian interventions fail to be discriminate, the result is likely to be comparatively minimal. So we're talking loss of internet connection or social media access. Now, this isn't to say that the loss of internet or social media doesn't have adverse effects on the broader population. Of course, populations rely on social media to be able to communicate with one another and check in. But I think Helen Froh puts this very well when she says, quote, "Social disruption is not irrelevant to proportionality, but it's not going to count for much compared to stopping a genocide." I think what this objection nevertheless highlights is that the principles of discrimination, so only targeting those systems liable, and proportionality hold for cyber humanitarian interventions in the same way that they do as armed humanitarian interventions. The third objection is effectiveness, specifically to the targeted educational campaigns. So these targeted educational campaigns, they're the ads that appear on individuals' social media feeds. And we might object to using these targeted educational campaigns because, frankly, they don't really promise to be that effective in dissuading the target population, arguably. So the time, effort, and resources that we put into designing these targeted educational campaigns are better off just being redirected somewhere else. Again, I have two replies to this. I like doing things in two. The first is, unlike advocating for peace via traditional mechanisms like radio or newspapers or TV or leaflets, these targeted educational campaigns are personalized. They're curated to suit each individual person. Really great examples of what not to do in this space and what to do. An example of what not to do was just prior to the US intervention in Afghanistan in 2001, the US decided to drop leaflets to sort of explain to the rural communities in the mountainous and rural parts of Afghanistan why there was now a US occupation. On these leaflets, they had a picture of the Twin Towers being hit by a plane, so 9/11, and a picture of a dove with an olive branch in its mouth. Remembering that at the time, this is 2001 in Afghanistan, the Taliban had completely banned the use of internet. So a lot of these rural farmers had never even seen skyscrapers, let alone the reference to 9/11. And then they looked at the bird and was like, what's up with this bird? We don't understand this. This is not a universal symbol of peace. Well, an example of what to do, a colleague of mine back in Australia conducted extensive fieldwork interviews in Myanmar to determine the extent to which Western notions of human rights make sense within the Buddhist population. And what she found was that things like the UN Charter for Human Rights just really doesn't have purchase within these communities. But if you were able to translate it through the principles of Buddhism and you get support from Buddhist monks, you're more likely to be effective. Similarly, the ICRC has a brilliant project called The Roots of Restraint, where they translate international humanitarian law and the laws of armed conflict into the tenets of Islam. And the idea here was to just trying to increase adherence to international humanitarian law according to all of the combatants that were party to the conflict. The second objection is, well, what happens if the potential perpetrators just scroll past the ads? I'm sure we've all received ads on our social media feeds that we take one look at and we're like, I have no idea why the algorithm thinks that I would be interested in this. I'm just going to scroll past it. My reply to that is that, first of all, this comes at no great financial cost, again, relative to other protection measures. And it means that we can consistently remind the potential perpetrators of the wrongfulness of their purported actions. We essentially flood the information ecosphere with this positive messaging that tells people that respect for human rights and toleration and restraint are things to be aspired to. I think what this objection might be pushing out a little bit more strongly, though, is what's known as the backfire effect. And the backfire effect is where efforts to correct individuals' beliefs result in those individuals supporting their original opinion even more strongly. But the existence of the backfire effect has been hotly debated over the last decade or so. So the consensus now is not that we double down in our views, it's just that we may not revise them straight away. But it is possible for individuals to alter their beliefs over time and through consistent exposure. The most important thing here, though, to remember is that we need to make sure we don't reiterate or repeat the original disinformation or conspiracy theory. This is part of the problems with a lot of debunking, because it essentially reminds the individual of their cognitive biases, and so it's much harder to change their minds. So as Porter and Wood put it, fact checks work. People don't backfire. Obviously, if an autocratic regime switches off the internet or social media, as they have a penchant for doing, then we can't roll out these targeted educational campaigns. In that case, we just throw the tool back in the atrocity prevention toolbox and we pick up something else. Okay, very quickly, some principles that I have for cyber humanitarian interventions. I'm only talking about them in the context of preventing and mitigating mass atrocity crimes. Perhaps there are other situations in which they could be deployed, like in the context of civil wars or rebel groups, but that just falls beyond the scope of my investigation. I argue that we have an obligation to consider using cyber humanitarian interventions in place of, prior to, or if necessary, during more forceful measures to protect. Again, this isn't just like a one-trick pony. You have to use other protection measures at the same time. The principles of distinction and proportionality hold. And these targeted educational campaigns need to be deployed universally in the at-risk side. Obviously, those who propagate extremist views online, and I think even more importantly, their audiences, can and should be targeted more intensely. So I like to think about this as almost like if we were trying to target Andrew Tate with pro-feminist content, you're not going to be as likely and successful targeting him, but potentially some of his followers or audience members that are still within a persuadable sort of mindset, you might have greater purchase here. The reason why I suggest this is to sort of mitigate a loaded assumptions concept that we might have about who or what might be persuaded to participate in atrocity crimes. Okay, so let's say we get it, Rhiannon. We know that perpetrators are online. We understand what you mean by cyber humanitarian interventions. We've navigated through some of the ethical objections to the concept. Who or what exactly is meant to be discharging these capabilities? And the way that I unpack this question is to divide it into three subsections. Who has the responsibility to decide when a cyber humanitarian intervention is needed? Who has the responsibility to design them? And who has the responsibility to deploy them? The next slide also has quite a bit of text on it. I'm sorry about that. And it's a quote from one of my interviewees, Chris Sidoti, who was a member of the UN Independent Fact-Finding Mission in Myanmar. And I think he really points to one of the key players that I'll be talking about over the next 10 minutes. Okay, he said, individual soldiers were certainly using their own Facebook posts to boast about their slaughtering activities in Myanmar. At last, we're getting the Kalars, a derogatory term for the Rohingya, or there won't be any Kalars left. That was coming from individual soldiers to their networks. Facebook should have done much more, much sooner. This is the irresponsibility of apologize after the effect, after the event, which seems to have been Facebook's approach until now. Forge ahead, devil may care. If something goes wrong, say, oh, sorry, we didn't mean it, we'll fix it. What happened in Myanmar is an excellent example that this is just not good enough. The anti-social media has gotten away with blue murder literally for the past 20 years. And so as you can tell, I'm probably going to be talking quite a bit about big tech. Okay, so who decides whether we need to authorize these cyber humanitarian interventions? At risk of appearing state-centric, I think that this needs to be mostly authorized by nation states. And this is because they are the entities with the principal responsibilities to protect populations, especially their own, from atrocity crimes. So this can be done unilaterally, again, if they're countering a violent non-state armed group within their borders, or in coalitions, or international organizations like the UN and NATO could call for something like cyber humanitarian interventions. The next question, though, is whether states would require a UN Security Council authorization to launch cyber humanitarian interventions as they do for non-consensual armed humanitarian interventions. According to the Talon Manual, which is a bunch of legal experts applying law to cyberspace, they say cyber use of force requires a UN Security Council authorization only when the cyber attack reaches the scale and effects tantamount to kinetic attacks. So that's basically like when the cyber attacks result in the same levels of death and destruction as armed interventions. And I think that's pretty unlikely. Hacking into perpetrators' networks, blocking their communications, deploying ads on Facebook is obviously not the same as airstrikes as with military interventions. But how are states meant to know that they need to authorize these cyber humanitarian interventions? Obviously, as people like me and Hannah know, there's a huge, long-standing history of early warning signs and forecasting and risk analysis as to whether an atrocity crime might take place. But I think there's a new actor on the scene that should help with the collation of that evidence. And so they bear duties of their own. And that's the responsibility of big tech and social media companies. It's often retorted by the companies themselves or their defenders that it's unrealistic or unfair to expect social media companies to be aware of risks of atrocity crimes based on their platforms, but I just completely disagree with that. Social media companies not only have a wealth of information that's geolocated and updated in real time, but they're also often behind enemy lines and in individuals' pockets. So that is, they have access and reach in areas that are otherwise blocked to activists or journalists, diplomats, and UN peacekeepers. And as we saw earlier, the information gained, like the Google searches, tells us something about what kinds of narratives and sentiments are circulating in the community at any one time. So I argue that these big tech companies bear negative duties to make sure that there's not incitement to violence or hate speech on their platforms, but they also have positive duties to monitor and report that content regarding incitement to violence or risk of atrocity crimes to states and the international communities to help them decide. Who designs them? When it comes to disrupting perpetrators' means for atrocity crimes, I argue that this is states. Of course, they can fund private corporations responsibly to develop those kinds of capabilities. This is the sort of hacking into their networks and blocking funding transactions and so on. But when it comes to motivations, I think there's a whole constellation of actors that need to be involved. We're talking local actors, influential thought leaders, grassroots organizations, civil society, diaspora, and international organizations. And the reason I say this is because these are the organizations and the individuals that are going to be best placed to translate the restraining rhetoric into a language that's going to make sense with those on the ground. To ensure this, again, though, we need big tech and the social media companies to be involved. And that's because they have their finger on the pulse. They know whether there's data for a desire for violence and where those sentiments are most strong or whether flare-ups might occur, as well as, again, what kinds of narratives are dominating within the environment. And they have the ability to consistently update and adjust their messages depending on traction in real time. This is just what they do when it comes to targeting ads in general. So having decided that cyber humanitarian interventions are needed, and we know who designs them, the question then remains, who exactly is pushing the button? Who's discharging them? When it comes to disrupting perpetrators' means, I argue this is states, unilaterally or acting in concert. Private corporations, I really don't think should have independent hacking or hackback privileges. That being said, states can hire PMCs to discharge cyber humanitarian interventions in the same way as they do with military interventions. But I'm hesitant to say that these PMCs should be able to discharge these cyber humanitarian interventions on their own volition. And the reason I say that is because I'm a little worried about vigilantism or profit or being drawn into conflict. What about the United Nations? This sounds like something that should be right up their alley. Well, unfortunately, at least according to a bunch of interviews that I did at the UN Office of Military Affairs, they're not likely to be involved. According to one interviewee, he said, quote, member states won't want to share those kinds of sophisticated cyber operations with us because they don't want to show everyone what they can do by wasting those cyber resources on humanitarian purposes. Sounds familiar. Another interviewee just did this to me and said, our hands are tied. Okay, deploying targeted educational campaigns. Well, obviously we're talking about them being on social media, so drum roll, obviously the social media companies need to be involved. I don't think that these corporations have the principal responsibilities to deploy targeted educational campaigns on their own volition, but they are expected to comply with the demands made of them by states and the international community. So I sort of talk about this as having tertiary responsibilities. That being said, these organizations do have due diligence obligations to research if the site is in fact at risk of atrocity crimes. And my thinking here is to sort of stymie against bad faith actors, kind of like Russia claiming that there's a huge host of neo-Nazis in the eastern part of Ukraine. The corporations can give insight as to maybe whether that's the case. So that's states, international organizations, big tech companies. What about individuals? When we talk about social media companies, of course, they can bear moral responsibilities. They are moral agents under certain circumstances. But when we're talking about big tech, we need to remember that much of the executive decision-making power rests in the hands of a bunch of cis-het white men here in Silicon Valley. Larry Page and Sergey Brin own 51% of the company's voting power in Google and Alphabet. Zuck has 60% of the voting power, giving himself, quote, personal control over every decision Meta makes. And as we all know, Elon Musk just straight up owns Twitter. So in addition to all of the other duties that I've just walked through, I do argue that these CEOs bear individual responsibilities to allow their platforms to be used for cyber humanitarian interventions, all things being considered. I'll wrap up now because I'm more excited to hear your thoughts on this. I've shown that perpetrators of atrocity crimes are online, so this gives us an opportunity to target them in those ways and to mitigate their use of these technologies. I propose using cyber humanitarian interventions to do so, to disrupt their means and their motivations. There are, of course, ethical considerations that are a part of this, but I don't ultimately think they're insurmountable. They're important, but they're not insurmountable. And I think there's a constellation of actors, including big tech, that need to be responsible for bringing this to light. So I'll leave it there, and I'm really excited for your questions. Thanks.
So we'll proceed as normal in these seminars, which is to open the first questions to fellows and then go afterwards. And I'm sorry if I don't know all your names, but I'll just point. I hope that's okay. Yes, go ahead. Yes.
Hey, Rhiannon, great talk. I'm Max. I'm a postdoctoral fellow here at CSAC and the Stanford Center for AI Safety in Surrey. A question and a comment. Does your work cover the appropriate level of intervention regarding different situations? Because different interventions have different levels of escalation. So you can interfere with technical capabilities similar to Stuxnet or just a targeted advertising or ad campaign, or also interfering with elections, right? At which point is which intervention appropriate and who decides that? Mm-hmm. And as a comment, just an idea, but I'm biased. Have you thought about looking at how chatbot and large language models interactions between individual users could also be used as a kind of intervention? Because as someone who uses a model multiple times a day, right, to summarize documents, write emails, write codes, it's a very personal interaction. And it's also replacing Google for most tasks that would have used Google in the past. Maybe that offers different angles for these kind of interventions. Thank you.
Yeah, amazing. Thanks, Max. If I understand the first question correctly, I do sort of break down when I think these different kind of interventions should take place. So I think when we're talking about hacking into the perpetrators' networks and actively disrupting them, I think that we should be starting to do that when we can see a buildup of troop movement, when we have, it's kind of closer to the outbreak of violence, I think, in terms of actually undermining and mitigating their effects. And the aim here is essentially to allow victims to escape or to buy time for other protection mechanisms to take place. When it comes to the targeted educational campaigns, I think it's really whenever we start to see incitement to violence or hate speech on the platforms, I think it's such a low cost intervention that it can be rolled out pretty early on. And the logic here then is if it's disseminated almost universally throughout the risk of atrocity crimes, there are going to be people who don't have any interest in participating in atrocities, but I don't think that that's going to, interfere with their agency or their ability to live a flourishing life in any sort of way. But I think when it comes to the targeted educational campaigns, we should do it pretty much as early as possible when we start to see a buildup of hate speech or tensions within a community. The more active measures, I think, should be closer to the time. And then when your question about large language models, so this is when individuals are talking to something like ChatGPT in their own private. I don't know. I mean, it's a good question. I haven't considered whether we would be able to mine that evidence. My guess is that the corporations would have a database of how people are using these kinds of large language models, and so again, I think it would be incumbent on the companies to sort of say, hey, there's an uptick of individuals asking the large language models whether all of this particular minority group should be killed, or how should we go about doing this, or how do I get away with murder? Like, I wonder if there would be something about almost geolocating where an uptick of engagement with those large language models are taking place. Does that make sense? Oh, thank you.
Yes, go ahead. No, right here, right in front of you. Oh, I'm sorry.
Hey, Rhiannon, thanks. Chance Smith, Air Force officer, visiting scholar here at CSAC. Really appreciated this presentation, particularly because I think it's going to have a lot of practical application moving forward. I can imagine you put this in front of some policymakers or decision makers, and there's going to be a lot of appeal, which I think is a great thing, especially as an academic. But I think there might be a bit of danger here too. And the reason I would say that is you could take your slide 11, that kind of benefit slide, and that could have been boilerplate air power theorists post-Desert Storm of like, here's air power and how clean we can make wars in the future. And so what I think we see is that we then intervene more in a humanitarian fashion in the 90s, Bosnia, Kosovo, Libya in 2012, and then against ISIS in 2014. And what I found interesting as I've looked at these campaigns and military interventions, specifically with air power leading the way, is there's this tendency to think, well, if we can do this thing cleanly, then we'll intervene with these really clean tools and techniques. But in the case of Milosevic in 99, or even the Caliphate in 2014, because we only use these things that were supposed to be kind of bloodless and clean, they actually accelerated the rate of the genocide. We see this with Milosevic in 99, the first bombs fall, he starts perpetuating these atrocities faster. And then with the Caliphate in 2014, they increase their operations drastically, right? As we kind of slowly just use air power. And so really what you find is you kind of have to commit. In almost all these interventions, with the exception of Kosovo, you had to have boots on the ground, proxy force or US. And it was never this clean thing that all air power theorists want it to be. So my question is, if you do something like this, will the perpetrators be aware of the intervention, the cyber interventions as they happen? And if so, would we then expect them to think, well, I better increase the rate of whatever it is that I'm doing, lest America or the UN or NATO, intervene to stop me?
Yeah, it's great questions. Yeah, I mean, so I struggle with calling air power clean, because the question is clean for whom? I think really it's asymmetric killing. And I think that sort of logic would necessarily escalate the violence, because people, their side is actually being killed. Like, we're not losing troops, but they are. That being said, the question to the cyber humanitarian interventions, I think that it depends what kind of intervention we're using. So the perpetrators or potential perpetrators would be aware of targeted educational campaigns on their platform that are advocating for this restraint. Ideally, that kind of messaging would be done in a way that comes from sources that are trusted within certain networks, or portrayed in a way that advocates for that, as opposed to being sponsored by the US State Department. Like, that's probably not going to be that effective. Maybe it would be. When it comes into actually hacking into the perpetrators' networks, though, example that I gave with ISIS was that they didn't know what was going on with their networks. It wasn't sort of, you have now been hacked by the allies as part of Operation Glowing Symphony. I think there's ways in which we can disrupt perpetrators' mobilizations in ways that they don't realize. I think if one of the outcomes of this is that we do see perpetrators realize that there's an international increase of attention, and so they escalate their actions, then I think that just means it's incumbent on us to consider other protection mechanisms. Because the way that I see it, we have two choices. We can either in some ways dirty our hands by using these low-ranking cyber humanitarian interventions that doesn't involve killing anyone, or you can risk bloodying your hands, either because we then have to resort to something like air power, which isn't clean in my view, or you allow the genocide to unfold and people get killed in that way too. But great points. Thank you.
We're good. Already have a microphone. Hi, Rhiannon. Thanks for the talk. I'm Johanna Rodehanuak, another postdoctoral fellow here. First, I wanted to say I absolutely love the idea of holding individual tech bros accountable. That's great. And then I'm going to break the rule and ask two questions. First one is I wanted to ask what, or like, can you explain a bit more why the targeted education campaigns have to be personalized? Because I get what you were explaining about them having to be contextualized to make sense in the context in which they are deployed. I don't quite get why we necessarily need big data on it and like why they have to be personalized rather than just contextualized. And this ties into the second question, so I hope I'll be forgiven to ask a second one, which is again about the big data that big tech is collecting, because you mentioned that those should be reported in order to monitor kind of like tensions flaring up, et cetera, which for me raises like the surveillance alarm bells, right? So my question is, who are they reporting that data to, especially in the cases where the perpetrators are the states? Yeah, thanks.
Awesome. Thanks, Hannah. Yeah, so just very quickly on the last question, obviously, if it's the autocratic regime that's facilitating or encouraging the commission of atrocity crimes, it wouldn't really make sense. I mean, you could use it to say, hey, just a cheeky reminder, you are under these legal obligations, you know, to protect your populations from things like genocide. But if that's not the case, then I think it goes to the international community. I think the big tech companies should be reporting that to the United Nations. I don't know if it really moves into the space of surveillance, if the content that I'm talking about is publicly available on the platforms, or if you're able to use the anonymous Google searches. I'm not talking about monitoring. One of the difficulties with it I'm proposing is that so much of the hate speech that we see at the moment is circulating in encrypted services, things like WhatsApp. So I'm not saying that we should be trying to decrypt things like WhatsApp and monitor those systems. I do think that people who use WhatsApp also use other platforms, and we can derive the data from that. And your point about contextualize, I think that's really important, and I think we can do that. I think this is a really cool example of how you personalize it based on big data. So those of you who were here last year and heard me talk about the atrocity suppressing disinformation campaigns, tragically, a lot of this inspiration came from the Cambridge Analytica scandal and interference in the 2016 US elections. I don't support interfering in democratic elections. People have a right to participate in the democratic process. They don't have a right to participate in genocide. This is a really great example of how individuals' big data was able to tailor make content to an individual. So they were able to analyze individuals' big data to get at the same sort of policy, that is in this context, support for gun rights and ideally for Donald Trump, but in a different sort of way. So this one's here to the right. The Second Amendment isn't just a right, it's an insurance policy, defend the right to bear arms. So this is based on big data of people who you could derive from their online activities that they're a little bit more, I guess, gung-ho, a bit more extroverted, a bit more, you know, this is what I want to do. On the flip side, this is more, I guess, nostalgic. It's from father to son since the birth of our nation. And so that's more geared toward people who perhaps have traditional family values based on their big data analytics. So I think what the powerful potential of big data highlights is that you can try and influence people to the same outcome using different mechanisms, even though it's all still in English, it's all still within the context of the US, it's all still within the context of a democratic election. It's not to say that we shouldn't use contextualized targeted educational campaigns, it just means that we could explore this option as well. Thanks.
Do you know, I mean, let me use the privilege of chair. Do you know whether NGOs, I mean, you didn't mention NGOs, are they using this, or are they thinking about international crisis group, these kinds of people who are anti-genocide activists, are they thinking about or planning to use this kind of
Yeah, so there's
interventions in their work?
Yeah, so there's two sort of responses to that. One is that I chatted to the Sentinel Project recently, and they were super excited about this kind of thinking. The other organization is Moonshot. And this is an organization that uses the redirect method. So that is when people are actively searching for things and it comes up with suggestions. When they click on it, it's usually within the context of counterterrorism, specifically in trying to get people to not participate either in far-right extremism here in the US or in Canada, or within jihadist groups. But you click on the link that comes up and it redirects you to something that tries to talk you down from that. But they don't, to the best of my knowledge, there hasn't been international NGOs that have been trying to leverage. I mean, amazingly, like if you've ever tried to put an ad on your social media feed yourself, it's pretty easy to do. Like you can just do it on your own Facebook profile and it costs very little. I mean, I'm sort of the view that the social media companies we shouldn't be paying the social media company, NGOs shouldn't be paying social media companies to have this kind of content on their platforms. And there's a precedent for that. So the big tech companies allowed the CDC and the WHO during COVID to have those kind of targeted ads on their feed without a cost. But to the best of my knowledge, I don't know of NGOs doing this.
There's a question down there.
Thanks, Rhiannon. Really interesting. I guess I'm interested in, and I do not know this literature at all. To what extent are you able to anticipate these events? Because it seems like anticipation is a key requirement for a lot of this. And so in one sense, and not just cyber humanitarian interventions, but any interventions. And so I wonder what the risk would be that you then, like, you actually impact the system by changing actors' behaviors and their engagement online, and then you lower anticipatoriness, or whatever the word is, for all actors interested in intervening. So, like what if you necessarily lower that anticipation value?
As in, thank you for that. As in them wanting to participate, or us thinking that there's an escalation and then it sort of drops down?
So like I'm saying, I mean, in the nuclear verification world, there's always a balance between, managing your risk where you want some amount of transparency so you can intervene. But when you change the system in a way such that actors then reduce the transparency of their behaviors, then it becomes even harder to intervene. So what if by doing this, you change actors' behavior so that it becomes even harder to anticipate? So then,
Yeah, no, that's great. Awesome, thank you. Yeah, so I guess my mind immediately goes to what a lot of autocratic regimes do, which they start to tell, especially after the Arab Springs, they were able to see that people were using social media to foster resistance, so they just turned it off. And I think in that case, if there is an intervention on behalf of the perpetrator state that's saying, okay, well, we're gonna shut it all down and we're gonna go blind, I think that that's an element of us going blind, but I don't think that that's necessarily the case in other ways of data collection and risk factor analysis. I mean, I don't think that we rely exclusively just on what's happening on social media. And so I think if the perpetrators try to hide what they're doing a bit more, and amazingly they don't, there's an incredible amount of evidence of perpetrators like very publicly disseminating their trophies online, uploading videos, pictures, and public incitement to violence. But if they do switch it off, I think that just means it's incumbent on the international community to have our alarm bells even more raised and say, well, okay, the country's gone dark. How do we get an idea of what's happening inside that country beyond social media?
A question back here, yes.
And great talk.
Wow.
My name is Melissa Salm. I'm a biosecurity postdoc here. So I was wondering if you could give just like a concrete example or maybe even a case study of what a targeted education campaign could look like, or like, because I mean, I guess a question is like, what are you educating them on? And what would be like the relationship between like research, like trying to understand what the motivations are for committing violence, and then the education that would be needed to counter that, or the kind of knowledge that could, somehow sway those motivations.
Awesome. Thanks, Mel. And congratulations for your job as well. I love this. This is such an anthropologist question. So concrete example is difficult because it obviously is case dependent. An example that jumps to mind is the colleague who I mentioned back in Australia who spent a year in different parts of Myanmar talking to individual Buddhist monks about, and the local population about notions of human rights and respect for that. I think an example of it would be something like trying to get maybe an influential thought leader like a Buddhist monk to recording a video of them advocating for, respect for their neighbors or love for that. I'm not familiar enough with Buddhism in itself to be able to know what to reference, but essentially drawing on something that they know within the community has resonance for them, in a specific way that advocates for, not committing violence, essentially. It depends on the context. Like, it's just really specific depending on where you're trying to intervene, but it would be trying to encourage people not to commit violence or support violence against certain groups. I realize that's not a very satisfactory answer, but it just depends on the case.
Like the education.
Yeah, maybe this is a bit of a loaded term. Like, I don't want it to come across as like a sort of paternalistic West comes to save the rest logic. The reason why I just call it education is because it's entrenched in facts. Like, it's trying to advocate for restraint from violence based on facts relative to the disinformation things that I was talking about, which is based in lies. So maybe a better word for it would be the targeted factual campaigns, but then you get into the space of like, what is facts and what is truth? And like, yeah, so I think for me, it was more about just trying to have it so that it puts the power back into the local communities and it's framed in a way that makes sense to them, rather than, just trying to disseminate a sort of Western notion. Yeah, thank you.
Herb, you want to go ahead?
Yeah. All the fellows gone? Just want to make sure. I'm sorry. What? Okay.
Yeah, no, I got
as a fellow.
I got it. I've got Tron, Herb, and Alan in line, so we're all set.
Okay. So, great talk.
An old fellow.
Um,
This is young.
I wanted to draw a distinction between what you described as cyber operations and which are essentially hacking operations, and informational operations, which is sort of like your targeted educational campaigns. I would have called them targeted informational campaigns, but never mind that. One of them, the first is, arguably illegal, and certainly illegal under American law and so on. Targeted information campaigns don't break any laws at all. So I'm wondering, you provided a bunch of people who decide to do these things and then to design them and so on. Why isn't this something that a private actor couldn't do? And they could get foundation money to do this. And so I don't understand why it requires a state to do a targeted information educational campaign. Thanks.
Yeah, that's a great question, Herb. And I guess it kind of ties into what Norman had said about, well, if NGOs want to do this, what's the problem here? Yeah, I mean, I don't actually see any problems with that. I think that's a great shout. I think the only thing that I worry about is, I mean, it would have to be targeted educational campaigns or targeted informational campaigns that actually try to advocate for restraint. My worry is just that, maybe a independent organization within Russia is like, great, we can spread these targeted educational campaigns throughout the eastern part of Ukraine. But then on that logic, like, it wouldn't be advocating for restraint anyway, unless it was calling for Ukrainians to lay down their weapons, which I think would be problematic. So I actually, on principle, have no objection to NGOs, which is why I talked to the Sentinel Project. They were like, yeah, sick, let's try and get funding for this. But as long as it's within certain confines, I think. Yeah.
Oh.
Rhiannon, a very interesting talk. What's the
just identify yourself for everybody.
Yeah, Trond, and I'm research scholar here at CSAC, working on cascading risks. And I guess my question is simply, what is the prospect that you can actually find empirical evidence of some of these things being tried? And just latching on to the last question, informational campaigns, obviously we have some evidence of, but have any of these more kind of questionable ethical types of cyber operations, can you, apart from Stuxnet and a few others, can you point to something in your interviews? Do people, are they willing? What is the prospect of them actually speaking about this? I'd just like to know what has been tried or what you can hypothesize has been tried. Then I just want to make one comment, and that is, I would have perhaps 100% agreed with you pre the latest AI revolution, but I would say to agitate for this kind of strategy at this moment in history, I think it's foolhardy, because we simply, I've been educating policymakers on these digital issues for years. We're still struggling trying to tell them that they should have legislated Facebook 10 years ago. So now that there's a whole new challenge, I think unleashing this animal here, suggesting that you can contain it with policymakers or NGOs or whatnot, I simply don't think it's going to work. I'm with Max on this thing. I think that a ChatGPT version of this kind of campaign could dramatically backfire in terms of public trust.
Let me add a couple of things from online questions. I mean, it's hard to get to them, but they're related to this. Is there any data, this is from Donald King, is there any data on public acknowledgement of CHI possibly blunting the impact of the intervention? I mean, sort of whether there's any good data that shows this works. And another question, say an atrocity, this is from Damon Coletta, say an atrocity is about to happen in Rwanda or Myanmar. What is the stable end state following the successful TEC? And can a TEC bring about a new balance of power at lower levels of violence or occupation? So these are all related questions about the reality and the usefulness of this suggestion or set of suggestions.
Okay, wow. All right, there's a lot there. Thanks for that. Just very quickly to your question on whether this has been used. I mean, I live my best D-class life, so I don't know complete transparency. There have been cases, at least in terms of the disinformation space that has come out. So as part of the Operation Glowing Symphony, the Allies released fake versions of the Islamic State's Ramir and the Dabiq, which is their monthly newsletter. And in the monthly newsletter, which was digital, and the monthly newsletter said things like, you know, al-Baghdadi, our leader, has been martyred, and we're all very sad about it, but the fight continues. And what they found as part of this campaign is that when the fake versions first came out, there was a degree of paralysis among the ranks, because they were like, okay, so al-Baghdadi has been martyred, like, who's in charge? Are we going to have a leadership spill? What happens now? Are we still going ahead with these campaigns? And then when they found out it was fake, so let's say you and I are both members of ISIS, you then come to me and say, Rhiannon, you must be a CIA plant because this Ramir of the Dabiq you showed me was fake. And I was like, no, Trond, I got it from Norman. Like, I didn't know this. And so then that fostered a degree of paranoia among the ranks. And so then that, at least to some extent, the Allies found that bought time. And I think this is what I'm sort of trying to get to with these cyber humanitarian inventions more broadly. I think that what they are most promising, hopefully, is that they just buy time for other more effective protection mechanisms to take place or to unfold, or to give perpetrators the opportunity to think twice about whether this is something they want to go through with right now, or it buys time for potential victims to escape. There's a lot of information in terms of, and I can pull it up on the efficacy of just targeted data based on big data more broadly, in terms of it being something that is helpful. Let me see. So this is the projected spending on big data. At least, again, a lot of this is just essentially from marketing and advertising. Like, I think we have an entire untapped resource here. We should be talking. I interviewed a bunch of folks in advertising and marketing campaigns where this is their bread and butter. So there is a degree of efficacy in terms of targeted ads in that way. I think this says 91% of consumers are more encouraged to buy a brand. Obviously, buying something on Facebook is very different from refraining from participating in violence, but at least there's some degree that we should at least consider this. And then I also think it's effective to the extent that Facebook knows when people are most vulnerable and susceptible to certain kinds of messaging. So this was a report that was leaked out of the Australian Facebook office, and they essentially knew when particularly young women, about age 13 were feeling most insecure and most vulnerable. And that tended to be first thing Monday morning before school. And so Facebook would then use that opportunity to target them with ads for things like Facebook, with things like makeup. So I think that there is some evidence that we have out there in the potential of this, but I'm just not sure. Oh, and then there's also like voter suppression as part of the US elections as well. So there's some evidence to suggest its efficacy, but we haven't rolled it out yet entirely.
Okay, I'm going to cheat and allow Alan to have one more question. We're right at 1 o'clock.
Don't leave it to the lawyer. The last one being the lawyer. No.
I'm Alan Weiner from the law school. Very brief question. I think I disagree with Herb's suggestion that these information campaigns are legal. I think, we have a very different view about whether, Russian intervention in the American election, which is basically a coordinated disinformation campaign, is legal. So it's clearly not a use of force, but there is a prohibition on unlawful intervention, right, in the internal affairs of another state, and particularly where a state is one of the participants in these atrocity crimes. Do you examine the legality of the use of force of these kinds of operations?
Yeah, I mean, it sounds like we should chat more about this, Alan, because I'm really curious for your thoughts on this. This is the only thing that I could really find in terms of intervention, and of course it has to do with psychological and propaganda mechanisms. This is Rule 31 on distinction in the Tallinn Manual, which again is a bunch of international legal experts applying international law. So what I really like here is that they specifically reference making propaganda broadcasts or transmitting emails to enemy populations urging capitulation. And they seem to think that this would comport with international law, but it is, yeah. So yeah, absolutely. Happy with, yeah.
Okay, this has been a fascinating seminar with wonderful questions. So thank you very much.
Thank you.